Hello and welcome to Working to Work, a neurodivergent journey through employment. I'm Sam, host of this project. And if you haven't listened before, in this project, I explore the intersection of neurodivergence and employment. In this season, I'm focusing specifically on neurodivergent creatives. And in this episode, I'm talking with Abbas Zahedi, who is an artist with a multidisciplinary, multi-medium practice. Actually quite challenging for me to try to encapsulate. So one of the first things I asked Abbas was how they would describe their work and their practice in general. One of the things that's particularly interesting to me about Abbas's work is it's very much in tune with the environments that it exists in, whether that be community-based work or installation work or photography. And Abbas is a neurodivergent creative. And so in this episode, we speak about Abbas's work and then also his relationship to neurodivergence, how that unique perspective informs the work that Abbas does and the interactions that he has with the art world at large. We also discuss ways in which one is able to get their needs met and potential benefits and disadvantages of using the label of a certain condition as opposed to speaking to a specific need. And Abbas speaks very candidly about his journey through multiple different types of work to get to where they are now, an artist that is being recognized for their talents and also their unique perspective. I think it's interesting to see this journey and that it isn't necessarily a linear one where everything has been related purely to art, but in fact one that has encompassed a number of different types of work, and those experiences from what Abbas speaks about inform the work that he's able to produce now. So I don't want to give too much away, and thus without further ado, here is my discussion with Abbas Zahedi. Abbas, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me for this project. How do you like to describe what you do in terms of your art practice?
From my perspective, I like to work in a way where I don't take anything for granted. So I don't know if that's a medium, but like in each case, I feel like all the elements that are involved is trying to really engage with every part of the process. So if I have a work that is on for a specific period of time, even like the timeline of the show itself becomes part of the work. I would say it's probably closest to like Tony Cox's definition of being like sight sensitive. But yeah, from my perspective, I think it's just very considerate. Like I feel like I try to make art in a way that's very considerate and very conscious of what it takes to have that situation exist in the first place, and not to kind of try to single myself out of everything else that's kind of around it. Try to embed myself within the kind of relational nature of the work itself, including the people involved in making it happen, but also the people that would visit the space as well. I did train with a lot of classic mediums. Like my first real training in a kind of art form was very traditional things like calligraphy, stone carving, working with wood, and doing it for years, not even considering the products that came out of that, just being very engrossed in the process. So actually another way that I would describe my work is process-based. And I think that's probably a closer definition, focusing on the way that I work as opposed to what is produced.
How do you then judge the success of your projects? How do you think, okay, this work, this is what I wanted to achieve?
It's very hard. I don't necessarily have a sense of how the work can be successful. My only real understanding is like just knowing that I was able to do what I tried to do. Like if I set out with a certain intention and then I realized it, to me, that's a form of success, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the work itself is successful from an art standpoint with a capital A, like art history critics, all those people. I tend not to try and think from their perspective ever, because their lived experience, their understanding of what they do. And like a lot of these people are kind of on a safari going around the world, seeing so many things that I can't even imagine what they're thinking. So even for them to say what I've done is successful, in relation to what? Because for me, it's just I had an idea and I tried to realize it, and I tried to share the experience with other people, and in a way that, it addresses all these kind of conceptual things, all these formal things, all these material things, these medium-based things, these conversations about contextual awareness in the arts. But ultimately, I just see that as like industry knowledge. The formal side of it is kind of just getting it through the door. But the actual experience of the work, I think it needs to also just land on a very human level as well, without all of that. And for me, if I can kind of speak to someone who's like where I'm from, or like someone just on an ordinary level, and explain the work in like one sentence, and they get it and they feel it, to me that's more a sign of success than like having someone write like a long review saying, oh yeah, it makes them think of like all these other things that they know.
I first became aware of your work when I watched a talk Tate were doing about neurodiversity in their galleries, and I learned that you were dyslexic. What do you think the strengths of being dyslexic are for you, and how do those manifest, if they do, in your work?
I guess it's like the kind of classic like non-linear way of thinking, or thinking outside the box, that kind of stuff. But it's annoying to think of it like that, because it's like, well, I didn't choose for there to be a box. Like I didn't put this box here so that now I have to be outside of it. And I see that being outside of it actually predisposes you to a lot of difficulty in your life. So the positives seem to come with a lot of cost. And of course, like we live in a world now where there's lots of ways to engage that are not just like written. So like dyslexia is often thought of as a written, like a issue of like reading and writing, where primarily it does affect you on that level. But I think we're still learning about what really neurodiversity is on a more multidimensional level, different forms of communication, things about long-term planning, about being able to follow certain things, instructions, rules, and also what are the conditions that people have to navigate these things within, and how do they make their condition more difficult or better, or like, if you're in a particular school, maybe with the same curriculum, you might struggle, but in another school with a different kind of teacher and approach, maybe you wouldn't struggle that much. So it's like people that go to private hospitals, they're often being treated by the same doctors that's in the NHS. It's just the conditions are different. It's not like they got better doctors over there.
Like less rush, there's more scope for them to kind of be treated as an individual rather than kind of like a number.
Yeah, I mean, even homeopathic hospitals where they don't give you any active agent as a treatment, you're essentially just being given water to drink, and that cures people. And you're like, how is that happening? But then you realize the consultations can be like 2 hours. And people feel very good, like about feeling they've been understood, they've been seen, they've been heard, they've been connected with emotionally around their treatment and whatever. And suddenly that has great outcomes. And then you go to the NHS and it's like 5-minute, 10-minute appointments under stress, everyone's stressed, and the outcomes are not great. And then again, is it the medicine or is it the conditions? And I think with a lot of these things, we question the conditions, but at the same time, how do people gain the knowledge and self-awareness to know how to create good conditions for themselves, or to what conditions they can ask for? Even me, I'm not so sure. I spend a lot of time thinking about that. And I think, it goes back to the work, like with the artworks. I feel like a lot of the time I'm trying to create spaces that are conducive to my own sensitivities and my own sense of what I need to exist in the world. And if you're an artist and you do contemporary art, there's this idea that you can do whatever you want. So I'm like, oh, can I create a safe space? Or can I create a space that feels soothing? Or can I create a space that helps me to like grieve this event or this person? And they're like, yeah, you can do whatever. And I'm like, okay, cool, that's what I'm going to do. So it's not even coming from a place of like trying to be creative. It's just coming from a place of like, oh, what conditions would be helpful? It's still a kind of survival response on some levels. And I think it's tricky to like go into that territory when talking about art, because at that point it's like, again, goes into this question of, is the art space providing services that should just be standard? Because if people are using galleries to create safe spaces, what does that mean about other spaces? Yeah. I'm not always so keen to like talk about the work in this way that it's like serving some kind of purpose, because at that point you get these like kind of more puritanical contemporary art people that are like, art should not have a purpose. Art should be completely aimless and functionless, and that's what's special about art, that it doesn't have to do anything. And I'm like, all right, cool, but that's great if you're like getting your needs met in other spaces, but then, you know, we're lacking a lot of space for a lot of things. Yeah. And maybe art needs to step up a little bit because it's the only public space that we've got left.
Do you think then, in part of your art being offering like a way, here's an example of how a different way of doing this can be? And do you ever get feedback from audiences that kind of clock that recognize, actually, this is something that I want to create in this organization that I run, or this space, or at home, or wherever, and because I felt actually comfortable in this place, or I recognize that actually this could make other people feel comfortable?
It's tricky, you know, because arts organizations, again, they're so under-resourced. You can't expect a certain level, you know, in terms of what they're going to do. And that's why often I try to keep things very simple in the way that I approach the work, because I do want it to be reproduced. I do want it to like be able to bring a situation back to like a more ordinary form of engagement. Like I don't like going into an art space and being made to think that like, oh, this is such high production. Like very few people could do this. I'm always amazed when I see it. Don't get me wrong.
But in some ways, I think very few people can do what you're doing. I mean, there's okay, you could say, okay, very few people can do this highly technical, whatever, highly conceptual work. I don't think those people could necessarily do what you do. It's not to say one has more value than the other. I think you have a certain skill sets and sensibilities and desires that allow you to create what you create that someone else couldn't.
It's funny because I don't see my own work like that, but I can appreciate that's how it comes across. And that probably says more about my own sense of like self-esteem or self-worth that I don't think. And maybe it's because I'm so concerned with like the survival aspect, or like the level to which I need certain spaces that I make to exist, that I kind of miss the sort of technical side of how maybe intensive that is as well, or how how difficult that is to achieve. And I don't necessarily see it from a technical perspective.
Well, because it's partly intuitive, right? It's like it's instinct. I guess you're creating from a place of like, this is what you need. This is what you want to express. It's not contrived.
For me, that's kind of like this dialogue element is really key. And again, I think to work in that way, to foreground dialogue, even in the way something is realized, it creates these kind of things that are not necessarily at the forefront of my thinking, but I do have to rely on this sense of, I don't know what better word to use. It's almost like a sense of taste, to know that when it's like this is right. Yeah. You know, like if it's a particular way, then it's right. And maybe that's something I take for granted in terms of like my own acquiring and development of a certain taste or aesthetic in terms of the way that I work. But that again goes back to not taking anything for granted. And like even with the work I have now in Tate Modern, it's like I put horns on it. I didn't have to put horns on those works. Sonically, it would still do a lot of what it does without the horns. But I put the horns there so that it connects with the sound. And it gives a visual juxtaposition with the metal that relates to the infrastructure of the building and the space. And also in these buildings, there's brass, and the horns are brass. So like that material dialogue between construction and sound and performance, for me was really interesting. But again, that goes back to the sense of generosity, is that I want the work to function on a formal level, but I also want it to be in dialogue in a way that is very apparent. I'm not a magician that's trying to hide my tricks. I'm saying, actually, even if you show the tricks, it's still very interesting. Like, because we're still learning, or we're doing something that's very meaningful to both of us.
Right, we had to move because there's a show that was downstairs, but we're now upstairs. Thank you, Abbas, for joining me in the Resonance upstairs space. One thing that you said that was interesting to me was talking about being outside the box, and you saying that you didn't ask for it to be a box. And I think sometimes, like, a future I'd like to see is, they're not being a box and need to be outside of, they're just being different ways of kind of communicating and behaving and thinking, and people kind of recognizing that.
I hear what you're saying. I mean, there's always that difficulty with, like, when you talk about neurodivergence, then you create this new binary of people that are neurodivergent, people that are neurotypical, and then it's kind of like the neurodivergent people have to do all this extra work in order to come across in a neurotypical society and structure that's built for people that think in a different way to them. And then it kind of, where does the responsibility lie? Does the responsibility lie on the, like what is the vision of society? Do we have a society where people that are more privileged take care of more vulnerable, marginalized, less privileged people? Or do we have a vision of society that's like kind of survival of the fittest? So there is no necessary structure. It's the job of everyone to kind of bend and shape society towards their particular strengths and weaknesses. And so if enough neurodiverse people with a particular disposition gain enough influence, they can like shift society to like cater more for their needs at the expense of other people's needs, and it becomes this like struggle between different groups of people. And that's kind of where we're at now, I feel, in a way where like people with resources are just like taking the piss, like they just do that, making society function in a way that serves mostly their interests. And so I think this question of how we classify neurodivergence feeds into a bigger question of what is our view of society with respect to vulnerability, marginalization, with people that have to exist at the periphery or in less visible spaces, less provisioned spaces. And then that kind of puts us, in a place where we don't just get an answer of what to do. We get an answer where people are held accountable for the perspective they have in relation to others, often who are less fortunate than them. And when we start from that premise, we actually end up in a place where we have a bit more clarity, a bit more transparency. Because if I know, for example, that a certain Tory MP thinks about me in a certain way, then I will know that in his eyes, I'm already a write-off. Like he already thinks I'm finished. Like from I think it was Margaret Thatcher. I think she said something like, if you're over the age of 30 and still using a bus as a form of transport, then you failed. You're basically finished. So from her perspective, like majority of people are like out. They're out of the game. They're just there to like keep the system afloat for the rest. And I think it's really important to understand how people at different points of a particular paradigm view the rest of the paradigm. And I think in art, the way that I try to work is sometimes trying to answer those questions for myself. If you create these situations or these scenarios that are quite complex and relational and engage all these different perspectives, often you get a sense of how people are thinking in relation to one another. Yeah, like with the Tate Modern show, there was a lot of conversation with the curators around the duration of the show being 1 year long, which is quite unusual. And again, me wanted to make that part of the work. They were very responsive to that, because for them, programming and having a regular support group, which is what I proposed every month in the space, which would occur in the space itself, again, which is quite unusual that an exhibition hosts its own public program in a way that disrupts the exhibition. So we have to turn off the sound. We take up most of the space in the gallery. There's been times where the gallery gets closed, like people can only come in when people leave. Like, you know, it's very disruptive to like what the work is meant to be, you know, from the perspective of like an artwork that just stays the same over the course of an exhibition. This really challenges that. And they were very open to that, because the principles of the people working on this show were in alignment with my interest in like a public art space serving the public in a quite significant way. So again, it's like you work it out from that side, but then you see actually how do they hold that space once it's activated. So once we do the groups, you see that they are really engaged. They are really trying to like learn from the experience. We have a lot of debriefs afterwards. And so there's just this kind of, like, things come up where you understand that, okay, there is a kind of conception here that feels constructive.
That's really positive to hear. So you would offer Tate as an example of an institution that like really is like doing what they say that they're about, trying to find new ways to engage audiences, try to represent work in the way that the artists want it to be.
In my experience, I found that to be true. However, it's such a big organization that I can't speak to every part of it. I'm very cautious about having a model of the arts that is very kind of paternalistic, you know, where we focus all of our needs like on the institution to address every type of situation, and then to make certain exceptions and certain, like even relying on these labels so much. I think there is, of course, the broader question of how to make things accessible. And within that, I think these needs get covered. This is how I think about it. And I'm very open to be challenged on this. And I know it's a deeper conversation, but I really want to kind of think about how can we minimize the need for people to have to advocate based on very definitive labels of what their struggle is. Like, is it enough to just say, this is difficult, you know, for me?
You're not going to get a challenge from me because I'm completely aligned with you and I want that too. I think one challenge sometimes, regardless of where you got a diagnosis, is identifying really what you need actually to make something easier for you. If you like, I'm just thinking about school, for example, like it's sometimes difficult to know if you aren't offered these different options of ways of doing things, to know what might work better if you're always only served like what doesn't work for you. But also because access to diagnosis or that awareness isn't equally accessible to everyone. So, or the ability to advocate for yourself, or the courage to do that.
No, exactly. And I think my experience is very particular. You know, I went through all kinds of things. I ended up with certain diagnoses, which they made me classified as neurodivergent. Like, I have all the paperwork to go into like at depth, like not just dyslexia, dyspraxia, on the spectrum, lots of things get highlighted as like, yeah, this person has all these diagnostic markers. At the same time, there are many people, including myself, who had a lot of challenging experiences growing up, you know, things like childhood trauma, various other forms of trauma that they've experienced in life. And we live in a society that vulnerable people are exposed often more in a way that causes psychological harm. And the impact of those things isn't always clearly understood as a kind of trauma response. And so sometimes what happens is those trauma responses present like a learning difficulty, like a behavioral condition, like attention deficit, like sleep disturbance or whatever, and hyperactivity or whatever, like, and then it's sort of like being treated as something neurodivergent on a kind of neurobiological level, whereas actually it needs to be dealt with in a more relational way, like in therapy, in more embodied practice. Even the diagnostic markers that we have are not necessarily accurate, because it's like the diagnostic marker exists within a particular realm of possibilities, and what you're dealing with might look like this on the surface, but actually it needs to be dealt with way over there.
It also doesn't necessarily tell you what someone needs. Like, so, but for talking to someone, as you say, like different kind of modes of support, maybe more kind of like one human, I don't know how to describe it.
Human to human.
Yeah, like is going to be able to understand like what that person needs beyond kind of any pathologizing. And that probably will be more useful in the long term for that individual.
It's not a coincidence that I was brought into the art world, so to speak, like almost smuggled in, you could say, by members of the Black Art movement. Othello de Souza Hartley, a photographer, Caribbean, Jamaican heritage. He came across what I was doing in a community context, and he was like, look, what you're doing is social art, it's socially engaged practice, whatever. I didn't know what that was at the time. But then he put me on to David A. Bailey, Sonia Boyce, all that crew that were doing the Venice Pavilion in 2017, the Diaspora Pavilion. And these guys were like, look, you're like us. What we were doing in the 80s didn't really make sense, but now we're like artists. And just, we want to bring you in through this channel of this diaspora stuff, because it connects to the work you're doing with migrants and refugees and cultural spaces around the concept of diaspora. I used to call it neo-diaspora because I wanted to shift the generational focus onto what was happening now. But it overlapped a lot with their experiences. And it was through that dialogue that I then met Hugh Locke. And he became my mentor building up to the pavilion. And for many months, I would just go visit him in Costa Cafe in Brixton. And we used to sit and have a chat for a few hours. And he would just school me on this art stuff. But he would also listen to me a lot. But without those people taking the time to really listen and understand, like I didn't have to go and tell you that I'm from a migrant family, I'm not white, I'm working class, I'm neurodivergent, I'm this, I'm that. I'm like, I just had to be in a capacity where he would listen to me. And I think sometimes getting these labels is helpful because it puts you in a position where someone will listen to you. And they may ask you for the first time, what do you need? You're dyslexic. What do you need? How can we make the art space more friendly to someone like you? But then it's like, if they ask it to you in a way where it's only to do with reading and spelling or comprehension and writing, then it's not really going to serve you. But if they do it in a way where it opens up your concept of having needs, of being able to advocate, of being able to request things, of being able to feel valued in a space where you've often felt excluded, if they speak to you in that way and they make you curious about yourself in a way that feels appreciated in this area, then something else can happen. And I think that's what I experienced. And even when I was in therapy, like I was in a kind of rehabilitative program for around 10 years at the Tavistock clinic, and I was attending therapy there daily for periods of that, longer than year stretches. And they were not giving me diagnoses. Every time I asked them for diagnosis, they were saying, no, we just needed to keep talking. And it was in that talking and in that recognition that something else occurred that is harder to pin down.
This term neurodivergent was quite helpful for me in a sense to be able to then have like terminology to look up and then see other people with similar life experiences and challenges to me to be able to kind of move forward. I don't go around saying to people I'm neurodivergent or I'm this or I'm that, but it was a gateway much more useful than depression. I'm depressed. That's not going to help me find, like, understand myself better, or it didn't help me, or anxiety. So in a kind of tempered sense, I think it can be useful.
No, I think it's really important. These terms that like dyslexic, neurodivergent, autistic, etc. I think of it like it's a form of machine language. Yeah, we're using these terms to describe humans because we have ended up in a system that is highly bureaucratic and is highly mechanized in terms of how it deals with human life, with society, and this conception of society that foregrounds bureaucracy, this very kind of like quantified approach, very economic approach to like problems that humans are having, requires this kind of sort of machine language of everyone being able to present their particular like it's like your particular software, your particular like if you was a computer, I've got like 18 gig of RAM.
Yeah.
But someone with ADHD might only have 2 gig of RAM. And so their short-term memory is flying all over the place because they're only able to buffer 2 gigabytes at a time. So they can't think in larger period sections. They have to think just little sections, hyperactive, switching constantly. So it's more like a quantum computer, whereas someone with like 64 gigabytes of RAM has a lot of bandwidth to process like information in a particular way. So we're often having to think of ourselves in this kind of machine language as a way to make ourselves intelligible to structures that see us from a machine perspective.
Again, just going back to kind of what potentially a diagnosis or an understanding of how one's traits like link to something, I think can be beyond be able to find a community that supports an individual or the right support. Like it can help reduce some sense of like inadequacy. So for example, I've got a pretty bad short-term memory, but I think there's something quite comforting in recognizing somehow that there's other people like me that have these challenges, and then seeing kind of what are the kind of positive things that one is proud of. So for example, I'd say dyslexic people, lots of neurodivergent people are systems thinkers. Like I think the way that you speak about the work that you do and the depth in terms of looking at how all these different things connect. And I think that can be incredibly useful.
I like this, by the way. I think it's really important to have this kind of ability to relate to your own self and your own way of having that self-awareness in it, to be honest, is a form of privilege, right? Not everyone with these shortcomings, if you want to see them that way, or these particular ways of communicating or processing information or whatever, will have the self-awareness. And my point is that yes, we need to celebrate, and you know, in many ways, people like me are being celebrated when we're putting on these public things and whatever. But I'll be honest with you, man. Like, I'll be celebrated, but it still doesn't make me feel valued, you know, because it's like there's all these parts of me that are not seen, that I have to feel like now I'm being celebrated. I have to live up to this idea that I've got my shit together, or that I know that I am this genius person, where all I've done is the system ain't working. I've learned how to code. And in the way that I work is recoding the thing and just like doing things where I'm just like, yeah, we can't take it for granted. And I'm just figuring it out, like how to make it suit better people that have these particular needs, which I relate to. And the point about that is that there are 35 years or so that you have to live with a condition, and it impacts you in a way that does affect your sense of self-worth, your self-esteem, and it does impart a sense of like trauma or misunderstanding, and then you have to spend the next 35 years of your life that coming to terms with that, and then overcoming the challenges that you were facing, and probably surpassing many people in certain areas, because you become so determined with this new knowledge. It kind of gives you motivation to do things, right? because of this ability to adapt and to shift and to respond and to push through and to like, you know, like really take it in your stride, there's still this kind of underlying thing that needs to be resolved from the period where it did put in you this stuff that is a bit more darker and difficult and negative, and things about yourself where you may struggle with things that if you vocalize them or if you express them, you wouldn't necessarily get the positive response. So you kind of get shifted into like presenting your situation in a way that's more positive, so as to elicit a better kind of understanding of this condition. And there's certain parts of it that kind of go unheard.
If you're interacting with like an institution and you want to make sure that this is going to be a like a gratifying, like healthy relationship, do you frame it as I'm dyslexic and thus this XYZ, or do you say it helps me when the text is larger or something like that, or whatever, however you feel dyslexia impacts you, that sometimes you need some support?
This is a really important point, because I went to medical school despite the difficulties I had, but that's because I came from a family where there was a lot of illness in my family, and I was the only like relatively healthy person. And so all this pressure was put on me from when I was I was parentified, and to like be the savior of the family. And like, if you're an immigrant family, like the thing to do is be a doctor, be a lawyer, whatever. So I went into medical school off the back of that with an insane amount of pressure on myself. And psychologically, it was very damaging to put that much pressure on myself at that age, to feel like I have to succeed in this career in order to like have a long-term sustainable future in this country. And like, if I fail at this, like my whole family can die. And eventually they did die. But the point is that the blow that I took from when that happened was much more severe because of the pressure I put on myself to get into a position to help them. And the point here is that like, when I had later my assessment, when I went to art school around my neurodivergence, and I was assessed, like I had all these assessments, it went on for days, and you know, I was like told I have all these issues. They were shocked how I did a medical degree. They were just like, someone with this profile, this medical degree would have been like torture for them, you know? And I was like, yeah, it kind of was, but I just thought that was normal. And so it's like we subject ourselves to things where we kind of normalize levels of like functioning and suffering and pain in order to achieve something.
But also the extent to which you're feeling it, like, because sometimes you'll tell someone, express like you're struggling with something, and someone will say, oh, we all feel like that sometimes. I only think that some people recognize the extent to perhaps like one is anxious or one is really struggling, whatever the situation is, that maybe like, again, just for the purpose of this conversation, a neurodivergent person might be experiencing versus what that person experiences when they say, oh, we all feel a bit like that sometimes. It's like different levels, and the difference in the level is what causes like the real damage, I think.
Yeah, and I think that level of not being heard, not being seen can be re-traumatizing in some ways. And those kind of comments that someone might make in a well-intentioned way. That's why I'm kind of like trying to get into a point where like more like neurotypical people also have to disclose the things they struggle with. It's only fair if we all do it, you know, like, because I guess the point I'm making, where you were asking about how do I ask for help? Do I say I'm dyslexic? Do I say this? Do I say that? When I went through these assessments and they were telling me like, these are the issues you have, the point there for me was like, I got the paperwork, I got the labels, yes, and you often do need that because we're dealing with a machine structure and we have to give it machine language in order for it to recognize and to see us. Like if you write a random code in a computer, it's not going to give you a response. But if you write the syntax of like JavaScript or Python or whatever, then it will give a response. And that's essentially how I understand labels, is that this is the machine's language. But at the same time, I want to maintain operating at a human language as much as possible. And in a human language, you know, I was told that when I have interviews to request, like if there's a application for an interview, to request like someone to talk to on the phone about the application. Like even just giving them a heads up that I'm applying and like talking to them and saying that's not always possible, like with Arts Council, etc. But they do have these kind of workshops and surgeries where you can get help sometimes, and they give you like person to support you with your access needs and stuff. But like in an institution or in any other work relationship, if you know that like spoken is your go-to mode of communication, then just try to ask for that. So I don't even try to be like, I'm dyslexic. I'll just be like, can I speak to you?
Yeah.
And I think just on that level, to see how someone responds. If they're like, why? Just go read it, just write me an email. I'll be like, I don't know if I really want to talk to this person. But if they're like, yeah, I'll make some time to talk to you, then I think, okay, there's something here. They're receptive. The more we can root this stuff in like basic modes of interaction, the more we can help people feel seen and recognized on a human level. Because when you're, when you're doing a lot of things, you're not going to have an access worker next to you, And so it's like, how does that make you feel if you feel like every time I engage with something, I need support? That makes you feel like on your own, there's something deficient. And that's not to say that isn't the case. But I'm also just trying to understand, like, is there a way of framing things to make this stuff a bit more like normal?
We're aligned 100%. I would take the same approach. And I feel like that approach of just like, could I speak to you? Because it would actually be beneficial for me in terms of like filling out this application, starts to normalize that type of requests. Like, and it's not linked to any kind of condition. And that's the way maybe it starts to permeate in terms of being able to make whatever position or opportunity accessible.
No, I agree. I mean, there's so many elements to this. I just think it's very important to access the problem on multiple levels.
If there was someone watching this and thinking like, I make art, like this is speaking to my experience, I really want to be out there with it, but they don't know how, or they perceive that they've had challenges by articulating or kind of convincing people that this has value, what would you offer to them if there wasn't someone maybe that was a kind of a real supporter of them in their life, or that they'd interacted with that could kind of give them that step up and advice?
I mean, in my case, I was brought into a kind of art practice without going to art school. But before that, I was it's almost like I constructed my own art school through the social projects that I was doing. So I spent 6-7 years with some friends in a fish and chip shop in Labrador Grove, just reading philosophy, literature, arts, humanities kind of material. And we were all kind of immigrant kids trying to work it out, like what we were doing. So that was a kind of forum that we had to share and exchange information, because we realized that a lot of the things we were studying, whether it was medicine, sciences, they weren't necessarily providing us social and cultural capital. They would give us jobs, but they wouldn't really give us a way to live the full spectrum of human experience within this context of living in, being the first people that's born in UK or Europe, as a whole. And so we had to level up on a lot of things. Otherwise, we're just going to only be in our own little kind of immigrant bubble, or like this kind of ghettoized existence where only things that are like marketed are relevant to us. So like we know about fashion and music and stuff that's like popular culture generally, and we don't really have access to like other avenues of expression and ideas that go into like the different parts of human experience. And I think that was my big motivation to like kind of
was that a conscious thing? Sorry to interrupt. Was that like, were you conscious of I want this kind of social capital, like, and this is how or it was just to organically start having conversations because you all felt like, hey, there's something missing?
Yeah. I think what was conscious about it was like, a lot of us came from Muslim experiences, we weren't necessarily like practicing, or like believing in it, but that was our heritage. And it's post 9/11 So we all being put under the microscope to answer like big, like cosmic and existential questions everywhere we go. Like people are now curious about, so what, do you lot think it's valid to do that? And I'm like, who you lot? Like, I didn't do that. You know, like, why are you asking me? They're like, but yeah, don't you believe that? I'm like, no, but that, doesn't your family believe that? You know, suddenly that all these questions are coming and we're realizing that we can't really answer them. I remember being in medical school reading Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, which was written in the 90s, and it looks at the world through this kind of like this idea, the axis of evil, like the Muslim evil and the Christian West as the good, and how this one has to neutralize that one, and that gave the justification for like the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, the Gulf War, and you know, like all these things were coming with these kind of ideas justifying why this American colonial strategy that existed for all these decades, you know, Vietnam, all these things, is that they see themselves as a continuation of like this kind of missionary kind of approach of spreading democracy, whereas in the past it was Christianity. And so for me, there, you know, and now we see there is no democracy even in America, like even in the UK. Like these things became banal terms now. So in a sense, we were conscious that we were not able to really come to terms with this kind of question of civilization or something that implicated us on a social level to really be able to like exist outside of this bubble where we came from. So in the bubble, fine, things make sense. Outside of the bubble, we don't really know where we stand on most issues. And yeah, that's where it kind of came from.
This thought makes me just think of just people that are challenged by society, potentially forces one to become a critical thinker, right? To kind of analyze like what's going on here. Let's try and understand people themselves better. And maybe like if the culture that you're existing in kind of works well for you, you don't need to be this critical thinker. You don't need to think about it because it's all fine and you're not being challenged. This is potentially why a lot of neurodivergent people are critical thinkers, because it's a necessity as a survival technique. Is needed to be able to navigate the world.
Yeah, and I think, you know, this is a really important point, because does being dyslexic mean that you're naturally better at thinking in terms of systems and processes, or does being dyslexic make you aware of systems and processes because the systems and processes that are in place block you from being able to be a full human? So now you spend half of your day, every day, analyzing systems and processes.
This goes back to your programming, trying to figure out the way through that you can kind of...
Yeah, and that's why I'm slightly reluctant to be like, my dyslexia makes me think outside the box. It's like, I'm only able to think outside the box.
Yeah.
And I spend a lot of time trying to figure out what the fuck is this box? So, like, again, it's just like, it's one of those things where I don't want to glamorize any aspect of it or make it sound like it's doing more than it's actually doing. Going back to that, just normalizing.
If there was like a neurodivergent creative listening to this and thinking, I'd love to collaborate with these organizations like Tate and other kind of notable organizations that you've collaborated with, where you've been able to get your work out there to people to experience, because I think beyond anything, that's the key. You want people, like, to an extent, and I think most artists want to share their work. What would you suggest that they do?
Yeah, you know, I never think of the situation in that way. Like, I never ever thought I want to do a work in that place and then I went there. I always did what I was doing within the boundaries of what I was aware of, and then each thing led to the next thing. And so even when I was in medical school, I went to UCL, and whilst I was studying at UCL, in the medical department, there was a unit you could do with Slade School of Art, where you could go and learn how to draw the cadavers, like the dead bodies. And so they taught you like art drawing, basically. And I did that course, and I graduated from it with a distinction, actually. And what was interesting was that was my first proper interaction with an art school, and I was studying medicine, but it kind of put me in touch with the idea of the Slade. It gave me access to like how to, like, I went to art like lectures and stuff like that. And so a few years later, there was like this open call at the Slade, and I applied for something because I'd been on that program. I knew about it, and then, you know, I didn't get the thing at that time, but again, it was another interaction with an art school that gave me a lot of learning from that experience. 2016, 17 is when I started doing my art practice. So there's like 7-8 years in between. A lot of that I was in therapy. I was in this kind of rehab process to do with a lot of loss and bereavement because I'd lost all my family by that point. And I needed a lot of help just day to day. I started a food bank with some friends. I did this kind of cultural center called Brumi's Cave, which was, you know, serving the needs of like migrants, mainly culturally, but there was a lot of art workshops, a lot of music stuff, a lot of different things where I was doing spoken word, I was doing poetry, I was doing a lot of live performance things. And at the same time, I was getting this therapy, sometimes, like I said, up to 5 times a week. And gaining the capacity to be very self-aware, to be very in tune with my feelings, to kind of like try to express myself, really like that kind of work is what gave me the tools to then be able to articulate things within the realm of like art and aesthetics and those kind of experiences, but then approaching it in a relational way. Because for me, all this community work, all this therapy I did, it was all relational. So for me, these things only have value when they're relational. And I was lucky in the sense that social practice was a considered way of working in art at that point. So I just had to learn how to adapt my language. So in all of these spaces, it was like doing things led to the next thing. Like doing therapy gave me the language to access this type of meaning in a relational space around aesthetics, and to work with public programs and to work with this socially engaged mode of practice. But also my therapist referred me to a job in a bakery where I worked for a year, and then I worked in food and drink. That's how I was supporting myself. So I worked as a chef, I worked as a baker, I worked in breweries and drinks, for all this hipster stuff that was in East London. And I was working with my hands, I was doing repetitive things, and it actually helped me a lot. And I remember reading that Samuel Beckett, the writer, used to also do like a lot of sport and a lot of manual labor as his main activity, to get paid and as kind of like his hobby, because it helped him to think. And I think by doing all of these repetitive things like baking, working in a brewery, as a neurodivergent person, I realized it unlocked a source of creativity just in terms of my ideas. And that in and of itself was quite interesting. And then talking about music, like grime music was a big part of me growing up. Like that's what I miss from music and art, because in music, like people really get the sense that they're building a genre together, they collaborate, they freestyle, they jam, they make songs together. Like someone might make a rhythm and then loads of people jump on it. Like, you know, there's all these different ways of working. Whereas in art, suddenly now you're solo, you got to have all the concept yourself. You're your own genre, you're everything you, and like you're separated from everyone else. And I think that makes it really challenging for people that require solidarity in order to like build up the consciousness around their work. Maybe the intention isn't to make an art career. Like I never set out to make an art career. Like I'm just saying one thing led to the next.
And also maybe they informed each other. You needed those different elements, like the therapy bit, like the going to the medical school, like helped you learn a certain language, then you change that, you adjust that language. Like this idea of like, oh, it's completely linear. Like I think you may be a richer person, like richer in terms of like your influences and the kind of your understanding and your experiences that you can then input into your work if you've had these different experiences. I'm not advocating for people having challenges, but they can inform and enrich in a way your life, because there's more input than just being in this art bubble, right?
Yeah,
it's like a politician that's a career politician that hasn't actually ever had any other experience beyond doing that.
Yeah. No, I think if you know, like I teach now as well, and I think what I like is that if someone's done like a foundation and a BA, and then they've taken some time out, maybe they've taken a long time out, could be up to like 10 years or whatever, and they've gone off and they've done something else. They've like lived a life, they've done different things, they've learned a lot, but in the back of their mind, they've kind of kept this flame of their idea of art practice alive, and they've done things, and then they come back at some point and they might do a master's with a bit more of a mature understanding. And then from that point, I think they can really achieve things. And I've seen that happen a few times. People that kind of had this big gap between the BA and the MA, and they used that time to kind of build up what they were doing just outside of art. And then they bring that knowledge into art practice. And I think that creates a really strong understanding. And again, like the stuff we're talking about, like being neurodivergent, makes you have to spend a lot of time focusing on that as an issue, as a problem, as a thing. And so you can bring that into your practice. And that's why I say that the way that I work, I think it does have this understanding of being trauma informed. And this is still an emerging field. And I think it's important to treat all of these things as being a bit more open-ended and emergent, and not necessarily try to have a definitive approach to like make your way the way of doing it, and to just be open to that kind of that conversation around it. And I think that's happening more now, and I'm happy to be part of this. So I appreciate you bringing me on.
Thank you, Abbas. I appreciate it.
Cool. Thank you.
All right, that was my interview with Abbas Zahedi. I hope there was something, or hopefully multiple things, that you found valuable in that discussion. I want to thank Abbas again for the time and the generosity and the openness that he offered. There's many things that I took from this episode that resonated even more after the discussion, when I was able to properly listen again and process it. So yeah, thank you, Abbas. Thank you to you for listening or watching. Thank you to Resonance for hosting the interview. And I look forward to speaking to you next time.